Okay, if you want to have your seats, that'd be awesome.
Is it on?
Yes.
I'm getting the meeting minutes too.
There were some 3x5 cards where you registered. If you didn't get one, I'll pass them out when I'm done. Those are for questions. You jot down notes as you go, so remember what your questions are as they come up. Anyway, my name's Vicki Biscay. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Northern Arizona, the ones who are sponsoring this. I'm real excited to have our panel. I think you'll enjoy them a lot. The League of Women Voters, the league is nonpartisan. It does not endorse candidates or political parties. You won't see that. It encourages informed and active participation in government and works to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We welcome you to learn more. Everybody's invited to become a member if you want. Look for the League of Women Voters of Northern Arizona webpage by searching online, League of Women Voters of Northern Arizona. I'll get you there the fastest way. I give you the website, but it's better remember WLW, whatever. Okay. Well, first I'm going to do a brief intro. First one is John Thompson. You want to raise your hand? John Thompson is a retired 16-year resident of Sedona. He's a former Sedona City Councilor and chairman of the Citizens Committee that developed the city's current community plan. He serves on the board of Healthy World Sedona and has contributed many volunteer hours as well as to several other local nonprofits focused on sustainability, civic affairs, and the arts. I don't know why I put this on 2 pages. Now I can't get it separated. Our other speaker is Paul Friedman. I'll raise your hand. Paul is a retired professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas. He's the author, mediator, and a longtime innovative facilitator of programs at Sedona Verde Valley Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, who cares about civil dialogue and mutual understanding among citizens with varied beliefs and backgrounds. John and Paul will introduce our other guests. So thank you again. I'll be passing out 3x5 cards to you just to jot notes so you remember what question you want to have. Put a question on there. It'll get answered at the end. Thank you.
You're gonna have to.
Well, I'm gonna perform a juggling act here to see if I can handle all these things. So first of all, thank you to Vicki and Marianne, who's listening in from home, and everyone else at the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this event. We really appreciate all your work on it and embracing the idea from the beginning. And I think it's a perfect opportunity for the league to share what they believe in terms of everybody getting a chance to vote. So, and I want to thank everyone else for attending as well. I know a couple people who are still coming, so we're going to have a really good crowd here, and I'm looking forward to an active and interesting discussion. Those of you who have attended similar kinds of things in the past, especially Zoom ones, you probably are familiar with having sent in a question to the speakers. They say, well, we'll have Q&A at the end. And of course, the speaker always run long, and then the Q&A, there isn't much time for it. So of the 150 questions, maybe they pick 3 or 4. And if you find that frustrating, so do I. So one of the things we've done here is we tried to figure out a way that we can have more time for you. And I'll be explaining the process about that in just a second. But I want to explain why we came up with this concept in the first place. Paul and I were talking after one of his OLLI presentations and classes about the idea of polarization and the problem we are all familiar with in our society and our political environment. And we wondered if there was something we couldn't do to put together some kind of a program that would help deal with that. Paul is a retired, but still very active communications professor specialist. is very interested in the polarization problem from the standpoint of just getting people to connect with each other and bridging the gap that has gotten bigger and bigger in terms of human connection. I, as someone who dabbled a little bit in politics, have a lot of interest in how it works out politically with a two-party system, and especially with the problem with the independent voters not being part of that, and what that does to how our politics work. So from those two different perspectives, we decided to look around and say, what can we find that we could do together? And this was the idea that came up, especially in an election year, with things going to be on the ballot about how our voting is done, open primaries and so forth. So that's what got this thing started. And so we decided on this program. Paul suggested the League of Women Voters. I thought, terrific idea. They thought, terrific idea. And so that's how it grew into what it is right now. But one of the things we had from the very beginning was the idea that if we do something that involves the independent voter, we are very fortunate to have right here in our own state, one-of-a-kind program. It's part of Arizona State University, and it's called the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy. And the co-chairs are the people to my right, who you're going to be hearing from today. And they are also the author of this book on the independent voter. So we are very fortunate to have them in our state, and especially fortunate to have them be willing to come up and talk to us about this and talk with us about this. So I'm going to set this down so I can juggle better. I want to give you a little bit on their background, because the flyer, oops, you can have that, Paul, that's my gift to you. So the flyer doesn't allow enough space to do them really justice. Thom Reilly is professor in the School of Public Affairs and co-director of the Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy at Arizona State University. He's the former chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education, chief education officer for Clark County, Nevada, and head of the child welfare system for Nevada. He has his master's degree and doctorate in public administration from the University of Southern California, and a master's in social work at ASU. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. His research focuses on public pay and benefits, governance, the independent voter, and child welfare. He's the author of at least two other books that are listed here. The Failure of Governance in Bell, California. You remember that situation? Bell, California, the graph that went on there. And that was in 2016. And Rethinking Public Sector Compensation. And that is from 2012. So we're very, very lucky to have Thom here. And our other speaker is Jacqueline Salit. She is president of Independent Voting, a national strategy, communications, and organizing center that works to connect independent voters across the United States and supports their empowerment. Salit is a 30-year veteran of the independent and reform movements, playing vital roles in the third-party presidential campaigns of Ross Perot and Lenora Fulani. She ran the Independence Party segment of Michael Bloomberg's 3 successful mayoral campaigns in New York. Salit is the author of Independence Rising, published by Macmillan 2012, and she co-authored with Thom Reilly a chapter in Democracy Unchained, and authored the afterword of Omar Ali, his book In the Balance of Power in 2020. She's currently a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and she's the co-director of the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy at ASU. Salit is a member of the Dramatist Guild and the author of several plays. We were talking at lunch about maybe having her come and do one of her reading of her plays here through Ollie. You watch your catalogs for that one in the future. And those plays include Shackleton on Ice, Votes, The Society of One-Hit Wonders, and Carol and the Grapes of Wrath. and Baldwin Kennedy. So she's a playwright as well as all that. So as you can see, they have very varied backgrounds. And of course, they are the authors of this book with Omar Ali on the independent voter. This is just from last year. They have copies over here. I think I heard Rachel giving the bonus price of $20 for that. That's terrific. You want to pick one of these up on your way out. And our library also has a copy as well. So, am I done? I have to consult my notes. Oh, yes, I promised to tell you how this is going to go today. So this is going to be mostly interview style with a couple of visual aids at the beginning. Paul is going to take the lead and explore with our guests in interview format the primary question of who the independent voter is and the importance of independence in our political system. I'll then take the tag team tag and ask our guests to address some of the challenges that independent candidates face and changes to our system that would level the playing field for both independent voters and candidates. So those are kind of the 4 different segments we're going to be working through. If you're wondering about how the questions might go. Now, we're going to take a short break at the top of the hour, thereabouts. So about 45, 50 minutes from now. And then we will reconvene to allow you to ask your questions. So where we have scheduled this for up to 2 hours, you'll have most of the second hour for your questions. So you have cards. You can use those to write down questions that you want to ask. We'll have the mic to pass around, and you can ask those personally. Or if you'd rather not ask it and just have us ask it, you can just write the question down there and just give it to Paul or me at the break, and we'll do it that way, okay? So enough of the preliminaries. I'm going to turn this over to Paul to get this show on the road. Thank you.
We're going to start off with our guests being interviewed by a professional interviewer, a gentleman named Ted Simon, the host of Arizona Horizons, a PBS show you may be familiar with. So take it away.
I'm not a professional.
No, it's okay. I'm not.
So my
I
wife
just
is
want to show
actually-
you that that's next.
Is actually doing this, but she's
This is
remotely gonna yell at me when I start doing things wrong. Okay,
this is
so
I have to stand in for Marianne Kenny, Mr. Kenny. No?
Can you see that, Marianne? She's with us.
As PND, or Party Not Declared. For more on the political impact of all this, we welcome Thom Reilly from ASU's Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy. Tom, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Number of registered independent voters increasing, and by a whole lot. What's going on out there?
They are. So right now, independents or party not designated is about 36% of registered voters in Arizona, 34% Republican, 30% Democrat. But as you pointed out, from May to November, we had about 93,000 new registered voters, 57% of them registered as independent or unaffiliated.
That's a pretty impressive number there, is it not?
It is, and it's reflecting what's happening nationally too. So Gallup tracks people who identify their party identification. And for the last 6 months, between 47 and 49% of people nationally identify themselves other than the two parties, more than the two parties combined. Now that's not registration, that's people who identify.
Who are these people? Who are these folks
Well, they're all
registering as
over the
independent?
place. I think the 2 points that I would make is, one is they're increasingly deciding races, and 2, they're unpredictable. So if we look at the numbers, I mean, in 2022 in the midterm, about 31% of the vote nationally were independents. But in Arizona, it was 40% of those that voted were independents.
Yeah. Critics will say that independent, this is a long time, we've been doing this story for a long time here on Arizona Horizon. And, The party faithful on either side will say that independents are basically uninformed, they're uninterested, they're uninvolved. They still lean left or right. They just don't necessarily want to get all that into it. Do they have a point there?
Well, and there's other point of some research coming out there that individuals are embarrassed about being part of their parties, right? So they don't want to tell people they're Republican or Democrats. But, our recent research where we looked over 20 years of data nationally of political affiliation found that this group of voters is increasingly unpredictable. They move in and out of independent status, and they don't have loyalty to party. So the prevailing thought before was that independents tended to be leaners. Hey, I say I'm an independent, but when I look at my voting pattern, I vote Republican or Democrat. If you look at how someone says they identify and how they vote in the next election, that's true. But if you look at over a long period of time, we find this group tremendously unpredictable. Let's look at national presidential vote for independents. Independents went for Obama by 8 percentage points. 2016, they went for Trump by 4 percentage points. 2020, they went back to Biden by 13 percentage points. If we took a vote today, Trump is leading independents by 10 percentage points.
Isn't that interesting? But again, the idea that these are disaffected folks, it's always been thought that there is no such thing as a pure independent. Are we seeing more of those folks?
I think we are. I think that we're seeing this great dissatisfaction with the two parties and the choices they have, which I think is driving a lot of independents to register as independents. But what is really striking if we look at young people and look at veterans? So about 60% of Gen Z and millennials have never been part of a party. Think of that. Most of us perhaps were part of a party and then left for reasons, but now we have the vast majority of young people who have never been part of a party.
And they
don't want it.
And they're not bouncing around. Those are your pure independents.
Right, they are not affiliating with party. And so the big question I always ask, since I'm around young people, is that, if you don't go to your political playbook, right, when you don't know an issue, a candidate, and how to vote, where do you get your information? And so, young people are increasingly getting their information through social media. But another interesting trend, if we look at veterans, particularly veterans under the age of 50, about 60% of those are not identifying with a major party and identifying as independent. And as I said, this group is very unpredictable. And we don't only have to look at the national voting for president to see this back and forth, but increasingly, they aren't reliable for either party.
Yeah. Last question before you go here, kind of running out of time, but this ballot measure on the ballot here in Arizona, they're trying to get it on the ballot to eliminate the primary system. That sounds like something that independents would go for, does it not?
Well, not only independents, but our polling showed that over 80% of Republicans, Democrats, and independents favor a system where an open primary system. That, and I think that resonates with individuals in Arizona that you shouldn't have to join a party to vote.
Yeah, and that's something that you're very much involved in. You kind of, it's a good idea as far as you're concerned, and you're pushing for that.
Yeah, well, we're not pushing the ballot initiative,
but
yes,
the idea.
When we look at the issue of the polling, clearly that's something Arizona voters support.
Thom Reilly, good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Not just a film, you're a DJ too. Thanks so much for your help. That was great. Well, we have one more sort of introductory background piece of information to share. Several slides that Thom will explain regarding research he has done about independent voters. So if we can cue those up, and I can present to you Professor Thom Reilly.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul and John, for having us, and the League of Women Voters. We appreciate you inviting us out here to the beautiful city. Yeah, so I want to just kind of briefly take you through a couple of slides when we're looking at just kind of wrapping our head around who's this emerging group of voters and why we see this large exodus of people who are in the two-party system. And here, if you look at U.S. political party identification from 1988 to 2022, And this is based upon Gallup, so this is a national polling. These aren't registered voters, these are individuals that self-identify. And you can see here from the trends here of how the independent voters has risen significantly since 1990. And the two parties, Republican and Democrats, two major parties, decline and pretty much have an equal share of voters nationally. Go to the next slide. And here, if we look at Gallup in 2023, what's interesting here is, you know, high in what, 49%, but averaging the last several months, about 47 to 49% of all individuals nationally are identifying themselves other than the two parties. So this trend is continuing, if not slowly continuing, and it's eclipsing almost 50% of the voters or people who identify or not party. Next slide. And what's interesting, if we kind of get a snapshot of who the the independent voters are from a demographic standpoint. So I mentioned earlier in the video, we're seeing close to 60% of veterans, which is a very interesting phenomenon. We'll be engaging in some national research on veterans, in particular, looking at voting patterns and the two-party system. But particularly with young veterans, we're seeing large numbers who aren't affiliated with parties. About 31% of African Americans, 52% of Latinos, a bit higher in Arizona when we looked at it, about 43% of Asian Americans. And as I mentioned before, upwards of 60% of young people, which I think is just a very interesting phenomenon that they have never been part of a party, nor do they want to be part of a party. And what that has a lot of implications, and we'll hopefully talk a little bit about that. But my main concern is that if you're not reading the newspaper and you're not relying on the parties, where do you get your information from?
Is this implying that these are the demographics of the independents? What about the white voters?
Yeah, so this is just a snapshot independently. Yeah, I haven't broken down specifically white voters, except for the overall vote being between 47 and 49% nationally. I think we have one more, right? And so this is tracking specifically in Arizona, and this, unlike affiliation, is for actual registration. And what we're seeing here again is this large increase of voters who are identifying themselves as independents. As I mentioned in the video, now 36% of registered voters are independents, 34 Republican, 30% Democrat. But if we look at the trends within the last 6 months, it's approaching 60% of individuals that are now registering are not part of the two-party system.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. We're getting our act together here as we speak. Thanks, Thom, for sharing with us the research you've done and the findings thereof. Jackie, would you tell us a bit about your engagement with independent voters, your website, your organization, and your experience?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, John and Paul, for organizing this, and also to the league. My thanks. I also just want to let folks know here, I'm actually a neighbor. I live over in Clarkdale, and I'm thrilled that my mayor is here. Robin, thank you so much for coming out. It's great to have you. And I lived in Sedona for several years, and my dad, who recently passed away at the age of 96, a World War II vet, lived in the village for the last 30 years of his life. So I feel very at home here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know all of you and to talk about this very important subject. I grew up in New York in a very political family, was very active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, in the alternative education movement. And by the time I was in my late teens, I decided I wanted to be a journalist, and I went to work for a number of years for ABC Network News was fortunate to have an early experience there when there was this funny little company called CNN. There was like the three networks and then there was CNN and everybody was like, ah, that's never going to go anywhere. Shows you what we meant. But I did have training there, and as it happened, was covering the 1972 Democratic and Republican conventions, both of which took place in Miami that year. And that was my introduction to politics. And skipping over a lot of time, I was drawn more to the idea of independent alternatives and became very involved in a number of different efforts, some of which were referenced in the introduction, which happy to talk about if they come up with questions. But what I do feel, and I was very fortunate to meet Thom and to get drawn into the network at Arizona State University, is that there is really an institutional breakdown on the political side, and actually in many spheres of life. I think we're experiencing that in a lot of different ways. But politically speaking, the political parties, which played a tremendously important role in stabilizing American society and American democracy, have actually, in some respects, turned into their opposite. They actually are playing a role that is destabilizing the situation and throwing so many people out into the idea that it's time to build new things, whether it's new parties or new mechanisms or new systems of conducting elections that are nonpartisan rather than partisan. The idea that bipartisan equals nonpartisan, which held for decades and decades and decades, really no longer holds true. And so these factors have really given rise to a whole new phenomena in American political life, which is the phenomena of the independent voter. And so what Thom and I are trying to do at ASU with the support of President Crow is to do a deeper dive into the independent voter. We think that a lot of the ways that independents are understood and analyzed and talked about and related to in the political world are incorrect and biased, and in some respects even repressive. And we're hoping that the work that we do at ASU on the research front can contribute to new ways of understanding and new ways of interacting and new ways of helping to bring Americans together to engage the critical issues of self-governance that we're facing, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the national level. So it's great to be here. I'm so glad that so many of you are interested in having this conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Something that has led to and strengthened the duopoly of the two major parties is the access that they have to media, that supporters of partisans have to media. There are cable channels dedicated to the viewpoints of the right and the left. And there are organizations, for example, we have here the president of DOOR, a social network to support Democratic candidates, and there is an equivalent Republican organization. What would you say are the sources of information to that inform and unify and give direction to independents, both in the media? What do they read? What do they watch? What do they? How do they get a stream of information that supports these movements that you're talking about to open up this political system to more than two parties? And are there local organizations or internet organizations by which independent voters can exchange ideas and form community among themselves? Hope that makes sense.
No, sure it does. I'm actually going to turn it over to Thom for the first part, because I thought you could talk some about the research on media sourcing and its impact on social relations.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, because I think increasingly we're seeing that the media now is not looking at politics just from the two-party lens. We look at numbers when over half the country now are not part of the parties. Analyzing elections just from the Republican Democratic lens is problematic. we pretty much know how Republicans vote, and we know how Democrats vote. Our point is, you really don't know how independents vote, because they kind of encompass this broad range of individuals that can be very conservative and very liberal, as well as moderate. So they, you know, to our point, they tend to be kind of all over the place, and they're, when we look at social issues in particular, right, they run the gamut of how they feel on hot button issues, whether it's gun control, immigration, et cetera. So I think one important part is that the media now is increasingly, when they talk about elections, looking at it also from the lens of the independent voter, which I think is really important. But, you know, independents, when we look at, we did our own research as far as looking at where people get their news sources. And independents get their news sources from common areas that Republicans and Democrats do. We did some polling in Arizona that mirrored some national polling that Pew came out with about where people get their information, and then who do you talk to about politics. And what we found is what mirrored some of the national data is that, you know, the more conservative you are, you tend to rally around one or two news sources, primarily Fox. Democrats have their own set of news sources. Independents, not unlike some of the stuff that Democrats and others looked at. But I think it was very interesting. We looked at who they talk to, and for the most part, Republicans talk to Republicans about politics, and Democrats talk to Democrats. So we live in these bubbles, right? We live in conservative, moderate, and liberal bubbles, because we tend to choose our news sources to reflect our worldview, to a cafeteria style, and then we end up talking about it with people who think and act like us. So there aren't many opportunities for people to share political and social identities and discussions, like forums that League of Women Voters promote. But one thing we did find that was very interesting is that when Republicans and Democrats had independents as part of the social network, it moderated their news sources. So liberals tend to moderate and be open to other type of news sources, and conservatives were open to other type of news sources when they introduced independents as part of that news effort, which, you know, whether that changed voting, I don't know, but what that does is that it allowed for different points of view, perhaps, that they weren't getting in their bubbles. But let me let Jackie continue with that issue about the media and where people go.
Feel free to stand if you'd like to.
Oh, yeah, I would like to actually, because then I can see all of
Yeah.
Thank you. I think your question is a challenging question, and I would say honestly that there's no real answer to it yet. And what I mean by that is that the whole question of who is an independent voter, right now, I would say part of what's going on in American politics is that the independent voter, because it is so massive, and because, as Thom said, independent voters have been determining the outcome of major elections over the last 3 presidential elections, and will likely do so in the next presidential election as well. That independents are now a part of the calculus, right, that politicians and strategists and media analysts and pollsters use to try to predict what's going to happen or to analyze what has happened. But while independents are part of the calculus, they're not actually a fully integrated element of the body politic. They don't have organizations that represent them. I mean, the organization that I co-founded in 1994 called Independent Voting, which I'm still the president of, which is an organization that's really dedicated to the proposition of making independence visible and insisting that you should not have to be a member of a political party in order to fully participate in the American democratic process. Hello, it's not in the Constitution. Parties are nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. And so I think the work that Thom has led on, which is to really try and challenge some of the categories that traditional political science comes to these questions with, as you said, you know, for example, If you say you're a Democrat to a pollster, they take that at face value. If you say you're a Republican to a pollster, that's taken at face value. If you say you're an independent, then the pollster says, or the researcher says, oh, okay, that's interesting. Who did you vote for in the last election? Or who do you plan to vote for in the next election? Or if you had to name a political party that you thought you were close to, what political party is that? In other words, it just doesn't have the same level of integrity that party identification has. Now, when 15 or 20% of the population is saying that they're independents, you can kind of get away with insisting, well, party identification really is the most important category through which to understand political life. But when you have half the country saying they don't identify themselves as Democrat or Republican, no matter who they have voted for. I mean, when you go to vote, you can only vote for who's on the ballot. That's another fallacy of that methodology that's so prevalent, right, in social science, because oftentimes when you go to vote, there's only a Democrat or a Republican on the ballot. So the idea you're asking, well, you know, what are the organizations and what are the sources of information that independents turn to? Well, that's very much a work in progress. And part of, I think, what's happening now is because just the sheer size and weight of this community of voters is so huge that institutionally things are going to have to give way to give independents equal status within the political process. And then you're going to start to see more institutional expressions, right? And independents will have an opportunity to choose how they want to be represented. Do they want to be in a party? Do they want to be in an anti-party party? That's my favorite. Do they not want to be in a party at all? So it's a great question, but we also don't know.
Yeah, it's a gap that needs to be filled. Sure. Well, I've got a page full of questions, and I will throw them in as we go along. But I'll turn it over the interviewer role over to John now, and invite him to pursue the issues that he cares about.
Cares about in addition to the other ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's shift for a second and talk about candidates. So they obviously are important to voters, and if, as you mentioned, Jackie, you look at the ballot and you don't see independent candidates very often. If you're an independent voter, you don't have that selection as an option to you. But what advantages would you say, whether they're fair or unfair, do major party candidates have over other candidates? And I think for the purpose of this, we can include third-party candidates if you want to.
Sure. All of them? That's an answer to the advantage question.
Take it wherever you want.
The ballot access, this is relative to, for example, independent candidates. The ballot access requirements are mostly incredibly unfair. In some of the independent presidential campaigns that I've worked on, which were mentioned earlier, Lenore Fulani, Ross Perot, Democrat and Republican needed 50,000 signatures to get on the ballot nationwide. As independents, they each needed over 1 million signatures, which basically meant you had to collect 1.5 million to 2 million signatures just to be safe. Media access, when the fairness doctrine was obliterated, the whole notion that any candidate who's qualified for the ballot deserves an opportunity to be heard, that has been completely eviscerated. And I will say, in the presence of this company, in 1987, when the League of Women Voters was forced out as the sponsor of the presidential debates, which the League had sponsored forever, probably since TV was first invented. But the League was forced out by the so-called Commission on Presidential Debates. I see some people nodding their heads. You all went through that, or some of you went through that. Commission on Presidential Debates is basically an organization, it's a fake organization that calls itself a commission that essentially is made up of representatives of the two parties, and they set criteria for how you could be included in the nationally televised presidential debates, which were hugely onerous, number one, and number two, in the polling that they used to determine eligibility, they didn't ask respondents, because they used polling criteria, you have to poll at 15% or more in 3 national polls. They didn't ask people who they wanted to see in a debate, which would be the logical question to ask. They asked people who they plan to vote for. So it was kind of a circular thing, and after Perot was admitted to the to the televised debates in 1992, that was the end of that. So, and that's just one example of it. So the bias is institutional. It's embedded in the statutory frameworks that have been adopted in most states. It's embedded in the media attitude towards independence, and also the whole idea that if you're running as an independent, you don't stand a chance to win. You're going to be a spoiler. You're just running for vanity purposes. You've heard all the arguments, and some of you might have even made them. But it's a cultural phenomenon too. And so, but I really think, honestly, we're at the precipice of that breaking down for any number of reasons. In part, again, as we were saying earlier, because the attraction of the two parties is they're both very powerful and very weak at the same time. It's kind of a weird phenomenon, but I think that is accurate. So hopefully those biases will change.
No, I'll just add to what Jackie was saying is that, another way to look at it is that if you look at the Federal Election Commission, which is a federal agency that kind of oversees elections, it's the only federal agency that has an even number. So it's designed to deadlock between an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. So, our system of elections is based upon a check and balances between Republicans and Democrats. So if and that permeates the whole election system, even down to the initial poll watchers.
Yes.
You'd think you'd want to throw independents in that mix, but in the majority of states, they're prohibited from being, if you're not part of Republicans or Democrats, you cannot participate as a poll watcher. So the system has been kind of designed where the two parties, as a check and has kind of checked and balanced each other, has kind of run elections, and that has worked well when the majority of people are Republicans and Democrats. It's not working real well when the majority of people now are not part of the parties. It's also not working really well when we really don't have a check and balance system. When 2/3 of our states are now under trifecta control, which means the governor and both houses are the same party. You don't have that check and balance system needed in the election system, right? So you basically have these totally red states and totally blue states, and you have very few, states like Arizona where you perhaps have a bifurcated system or have a control between Democrats and Republicans. So yeah, the system is problematic and it's not working, particularly as more people proclaim themselves as not being part of parties.
Jackie, you mentioned Ross Perot, and I was going to ask that, and then you brought him up. Are you, either of you, familiar with independent candidates who have bucked the system? That's a pretty dramatic example. But how are there ones that you can think of who have found a way around it? Or if the answer is no, or regardless of the answer, how would you see an independent candidate going about getting the kind of recognition they need? I mean, you get to the media, all the obstacles they have to overcome.
Well, I'll answer your question in the framework of the last 20 years, which means I won't mention Abraham Lincoln as an independent candidate who won the presidency and then had a very difficult tenure. I'll give you like maybe 3 examples. I mean, in the last 20 years, in a number of states, there have been statewide candidates who are independents who won. Jesse Ventura was elected governor in the state of Minnesota. Angus King was elected first governor and then senator, I think, from the state of Maine. Bernie Sanders runs as an independent and caucuses with the Democrats. So those have been, there was an independent governor of Alaska, right? My partner, Bob Carlson, is here. He lived in Alaska for many years, so I know the Alaska story. So there's been those episodes of independence, and they were very, I think the circumstances were very particular to an issue that was going on in that state, in which neither Democrat or Republican could gain traction. So there's been some of those. Lowell Weicker was elected governor of Connecticut in 1990 as an independent. And by the way, that, and a lot of the elections that I just mentioned happened in the 90s, which was also the period of time that the term limits movement was, term limits was getting on the ballot in all of the states that allowed initiative and referendum, and it was passing everywhere, everywhere, like from between 55% of the vote to 90% of the vote. So there was kind of like a sense of there being, you know, a grassroots rebellion against the partisan system. But some other, maybe perhaps more relevant examples, given what it is you're asking, I would say, I point to maybe 3 different candidacies. One was Perot, okay. Perot, a lot to say about the Perot campaign and the Perot movement, which did give rise to an experiment in a national party, the National Reform Party. Ross got 20% of the vote the first time out, but prior to some of the crazy stuff that went on in his campaign, he was actually polling at like 46% of the vote going into the spring. But that candidacy, Perot litigated a lot of issues, forced the issue of the, as his slogan said, we've got to take our country back. Our country's been taken away from us by the powerful interests. And this from a billionaire who actually knew from the inside what that takeover looked like. So that was one experiment that flamed out ultimately. But the importance of his candidacy was not that he won, he didn't win, but it did give rise to a 6-year experiment at building a national independent political party that was a left-center-right coalition. Second, I would point to the independent presidential campaign of Dr. Lenore Fulani, an African-American developmental psychologist who ran in 1988 for president and became the first woman and the first African-American to access the presidential ballot in all 50 states in the entire history of America. She ran, she didn't win. She said if she won, she would demand a recount. But the purpose of her run was, and by the way, this is kind of a funny thing on this, when she set up her campaign committee, you have to register with the Federal Election Commission. She wanted to call her campaign Lenora B. Fulani's Committee for Fair Election. And the FEC said you're not allowed to call a presidential campaign that. So I was like, okay, I know what we're in for. But her point was raising a question for all voters, but in particular for the African-American community, which is we're being taken for granted. It is assumed that every Black person in the United States of America is going to vote for the Democratic Party. And if we can build an independent path and build independent activity, that will make us more powerful. And so the theme of her campaign in 1988 was 2 rows are better than 1, vote for Jesse Jackson in the Democratic primary, and then when he loses, vote independent for me in the general election. So that was kind of an independent candidacy that was very successful. Again, didn't win, but brought an issue onto the table that remains an issue and in fact is gaining currency today. And you see that in large measure by if you look at, for example, falling support numbers among Black voters for Biden. That's an indicator of that growing discomfort with that allegiance. And then the third candidacy that I would point to would be Mike Bloomberg. The difference with Mike is that Mike ran in New York for mayor, and New York is a fusion state, which means that as a candidate, you can run on more than one party line and the votes are aggregated. And the voter can choose which line you want to vote for the candidate on. So Mike ran as a fusion candidate. He ran both as a Republican and as an independent. I ran the independent component of his 3 campaigns. Independent voters were his margin of victory. And he served 3 terms as mayor of New York, and in my opinion, did a wonderful job, and also tried to bring nonpartisan reform to the city. So none of those people served in office other than Mike, but their independent candidacies were part, I think, of a process of trying to bring more options to the table. And it's an unfinished piece of work.
And if I can just add on that, I mean, I think the other thing, the other lens of looking at it is that we have independents who are part of the party, but maybe the independent is a small I, who participates equally in the democratic process. And so, you know, it becomes exceedingly difficult for a party to run as one independent because they're just all, they're like herding cats, in my opinion. They're all over the place and they represent this broad spectrum. So you start identifying issues or topics that they're very divergent. But, you know, where we do a lot of our study is the issue that as people who now decide not to be part of parties, they shouldn't be excluded from the democratic process. And the fact that most of our elections, because most of our states are gerrymandered, they are determined in the primary. And to exclude the largest group of voters participating in the primaries, you know, excludes a large part of the electorate in their basic right to vote. And so part of that being a small I is not necessarily being, you know, choosing an independent party, but participating in civic life and the right to vote, which is really problematic nationwide.
Well, let me segue on that, and let's make this be the last one before we take our break, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. Structural changes that could happen in our electoral system that would help with a level playing field. So what's going on now with this election cycle that could have an effect on that would allow more independents to run for office if they wanted to without necessarily being thought of as a spoiler? And do you have any data or polling on how those things might play out?
Well, I'll start and turn it over to Jackie. I mean, I think that, you know, which you alluded to, there is a ballot initiative, you know, as a little state, as being part of ASU and part of the center, we don't endorse ballot or candidates, you know, like the league or nonpartisan also. But the concepts of open primaries nationwide, which is very important to independent voters and others, is that, you know, you don't have to join the party. Particularly, you know, since the progressive era, we decided that the federal government, because they wanted more transparency in how parties chose their candidates, is that the federal government start funding primaries, which kind of begs the question now that if you're accepting federal money, do you have a right to exclude people? So a lot of the initiatives that are occurring nationally are really kind of focused on the issue is that everybody should have a right to vote, and that a ballot should be, you know, not just by party, but everybody appearing in the same ballot. That's something that Arizona voters will have a way to opine on. And I think that structurally is probably one of the most significant issues, right? As far as giving an equal playing field to independents. The other issue, you know, that is tied into that ballot initiative is that you have equal number of signature access, you know, as Jackie pointed out there too, that, you know, if you want to run for office, you have a lower threshold if you're part of two major parties, but it's a much more challenging situation if you're an independent. But let me turn it over to Jackie for more on that.
Yeah, I think that really anything and everything that creates a level playing field for voters and for candidates is kind of in the wheelhouse of reforms that will make a difference. I would also add, just to build on what Thom was saying about the primaries, I mean, I'm a registered independent, and for those of you who are, I got a note from the county telling me that I'm not allowed to vote in the presidential primary. And that if I want to vote in the presidential primary, I have to register into either the Democratic or Republican parties. And that's a problem. You know, it's a problem. It's also crazy because, you know, anytime you turn on the TV, you know, they say this is like the most important election ever in the history of human civilization. But you're not allowed to vote, you know, so there's like, it's like a disconnect, you know, and I think, you know, part of what we've seen in our research, and I just really want to emphasize this, and Thom has just been so great in drawing this out. When you go to Arizona voters, for example, and you ask folks if they support nonpartisan elections, if they support nonpartisan administration elections, if they think that top election officials should be required to take an oath that they will perform their jobs in a nonpartisan manner, all of these kinds of things. The support for that is it's not just independents who support that, it is across the board, Democrat, Republican, Independent. And the numbers that we saw in our most recent survey, what was it, like 80% and above? Yeah, so that there is a hunger in the country for a different way of doing politics. And so the reforms that you're asking about, such a great question, they're not just structural issues, they're also cultural issues. And you find if you scratch the surface, as we try to do in our work at ASU, and give people an opportunity to express the kind of system they'd like to have, the amount of common ground that you see is huge. But you would never know that, right, from the way that politics is projected, and in many respects, the kinds of categories that people are forced into. It's very destructive. And so we hope that the research that we do contributes to a different view of this and opens up blueprints and pathways to pursue that kind of culture change.
I just add one more point that, you know, I think also that we're seeing a different change in how media and people talk about elections. I think we have more introduction of looking through that two-party lens, but also saying where do independents stand and where are they polling on these issues, particularly since they seem to be driving some of the outcome of many elections. And I think that's all real positive. From an academic standpoint, I think structurally what's changing is that, you know, academia tends to be somewhat arrogant, you know, in a lot of areas. But, you know, for how they've researched independent voters, it's been, you know, so like they just can't conceive of an idea that an individual isn't going to be part of the two-party system. And so their whole way about researching this and being so dismissive about this large group of voters, as Jackie kind of pointed out, is that when they ask you to poll, is they're asking, do you lean Republican or Democrats? And that's really important because where political science and academia has come from is that they count leaners as partisans. So when they start being dismissive about the number of true independents, they're only counting those that say they don't lean after they ask you the question and the follow-up question. And it really just minimizes the impact of the independent voter. So part of what we're trying to do is also looking at, you know, this whole notion that there really are true independents, is that they may say they are, but when you look at their voting patterns or not, you know, we've dispelled this as well as some researchers from Stanford, is that when you look at their voting patterns over time, they move in and out of independent status, and they do not have loyalty to one party or another. And I think that's really important Because, if I were, running a campaign, I sure would want to know more information and insight into the independent voter and how do you get them to vote for my party. But what's happened historically is that once independents lean Democrat or Republican, they start treating them as partisans. And that's why you see them switching the next election. So I think we are seeing some structural changes and cultural changes, both with academia, that this notion that there aren't independents, people are taking a look at, right? And saying, well, maybe there's more to this, and maybe this is a more complex understanding about voting patterns.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this introduction. All impressed with the rising number of registrations, the rising interest in independent candidates, and yet we're become more aware of the obstacles that they face, the harder road that they have to travel. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to return in about 5 minutes, and we'll turn our responsibility over to you. We'd like you to be raising questions for our guests to respond to, and we'd like to know some of your, if you are lean toward being an independent or you are registered as an independent, we'd like to know what your thinking is. So we ask you to give some thought in the next few minutes to what you would like to see us address in the second hour, and write that down on a card. I believe that we will collect the cards so that we can be sure that the questions that most of you have in common are addressed. And that we'll judge that by the number of the similarity among the questions that you submit. And when we go through those popular questions that are on the cards that we gather, we will then open the floor to other issues that haven't been touched on yet. So take 5 minutes. There's a restroom in the back. You might want to, for a donation of $20, you can pick up the book that our co-authors created, and you can have input by giving your card to Vicki or taking a blank card and jotting down your thoughts about what you would like to see us talk about in the next hour. So now is a 5-minute break, and we'll return with additional questions for our guests. Thank you.
There are more.
Okay, Christian, how you doing back there?
Just started.
Okay.
This was a group, so we can start with that. Should I do this?
Go for it.
While we're doing sorting over there, we did find that there was one that had several people had interest in. So we're going to start with that while we're continuing our sort. And that had to do with the open primaries, but more specifically ranked choice voting. So some people wanted you to know if you could talk about ranked choice voting, and I suppose open primaries in that context too. What impact would that have on what are your thoughts on ranked choice voting? It's pretty general.
Can we start, Jackie? You want to start? If you look in Arizona, there was kind of a disagreement between two different camps about putting the ballot initiative on about primaries. One wanted to include ranked choice voting as part of their open primaries ballot initiative. The others wanted to kind of punt to the legislature and have the if you have an open primary and everybody can appear on the same ballot, then what is the next step for advancing to the general? One group wanted to just to put the ranked choice voting as a requirement. That ended up not getting on the ballot. The one that did get on the ballot basically has the legislature and the governor having to decide, right, what is the mechanism to make the final decision. But we don't really have an opinion as a center on the issue of ranked choice voting, but we did do some polling on this, where we saw there was very high support for open primaries in general, over 80%, and that was with Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. We did see a partisan divide with ranked choice voting, particularly with Republicans. And you know, it wasn't really high even with Democrats and Independents, and so the ranked choice voting was about 50%. So I think that mirrored some of the other polling that was done. I think that's ultimately why the initiative did not include ranked choice voting, because they were concerned that that would kill the ballot, because there was concerns about it. So, you know, the only comment I have about ranked choice voting is that, you know, nationally it has seemed to take a partisan tilt on this, and I think we saw this really being much more pronounced after the Alaska election with Sarah Palin losing. Republicans, the Republican National Committee and others have taken positions. They've actually voted on it that they do not see ranked choice voting as in their best interest. Which is kind of interesting, because when you look at where ranked choice voting occurs at the local level, it's in Utah. You know, the majority of the local governments in Utah have ranked choice voting, and they initiated this years and years ago because more of a cost-effective reasons. That, you know, you didn't have to have another election. You had a mechanism if someone didn't get 50% to take, you know, proportionally look at the votes. So they looked at it from a cost-effective, but like everything else in this country, we polarized, right? And for good, bad, or indifferent, the Republican Party decided that ranked choice voting is not something they're supporting. So where we see the increases are some in municipalities, but they tend to be more progressive or liberal areas. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Jacqueline.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is I'm really glad this question came up, because I think there's a little bit of confusion around this in the following sense. Ranked choice voting, which is basically a system in which a voter can vote preferentially. So-and-so is my first choice, Mary's my second choice, John is my third choice, and then there's kind of a system whereby the candidates who receive the least number of votes are dropped off, and the votes are recalculated. Ranked choice voting is a system of voting. Open primaries or nonpartisan primaries is actually, it's a system, but it's also a principle. And this is what I mean when I say there's confusion about it. Ranked choice voting is a system. Open primaries is a principle or a premise, which is basically that in every round of voting, all voters, regardless of their affiliation or status, should have the same opportunity to cast a ballot. That's a principle. And so then there's different ways to design a system to reflect that principle. And one of them will be on the ballot here in Arizona in November. It's actually a fairly comprehensive reform package, because it also bans the use of taxpayer funding for partisan primaries, which is an important principle, and something that is hugely popular, again, across party lines, across ideological lines, party organizations or private organizations that are protected by the First Amendment. They're not the government. They act like they're the government, but they're not the government. So anyway, that's the one thing I would say about the ranked choice voting.
Okay, great. So I have one more question here that I'm going to pose while we're pulling in the others. But I want to tell you that our view of all these questions is that there were very few overlaps. So there's a lot of different questions, and what we may need to do is just think of this as like a zip through, because I would like to get to as many of these as we can. All right, so here's one. Do you see independent movement ever bringing presidents elected by popular vote versus electoral college?
I think it's kind of independent of the independent voter issue. I think there seems to be some dissatisfaction with the electoral college as a way to direct and to choose our president. I'm not sure it's necessarily tied to the independent voter, or the independent vote would tilt one way or the other. In fact, one gentleman was asking whether we've done any polling to look at, or do independents, support more of the direct vote versus the electoral, and I haven't seen that. My comment is they probably reflect generally where the nation is on that issue. But I guess the bottom point is I don't really see that as necessarily impacted by the independent voters.
Okay, well, let me ask you a quick one, and then we'll bring Christian up to read some of the cards. I would have thought when you talked about the successful or effective independent candidates in recent years, that you might want to comment on the fact that a current U.S. Senator from Arizona has broken out of the duopoly system and declared herself an independent. Do you have does that feel to you like an achievement or a significant move, or do you have any thoughts about Kirsten Sinema deciding to change her party affiliation?
I didn't bring her up because the question was people who had run as independents, and she hasn't yet run as an independent, not to be too technical here, but now that she has come up, yeah, I think it's a very interesting play on Sinema's part. I was reading some articles today that are positing that if the immigration deal happens, that she's playing a very, very big role in that. And part of what allows her, whatever you want to say about it, part of what allows her to play that role is that she is an independent. And so she's seen as more of an honest broker between the quote unquote two sides of the aisle. And I think she's just able to play a role because she is an independent. She has made that statement, and hopefully something good will come out of that. The notion that's being talked about in the press is that if that deal succeeds, that she basically gets reelected no matter how she runs. She has until April, I think we've talked about. She has to decide by April. She has to declare by April with the Secretary of State whether she's running. And so, that's just a few months away, and so we'll see. But I think it's a little bit of a harbinger of things to come. I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing happening. People run as major party candidates, get into office, they sort of get the feel of the situation, and then they're free to become an independent and to try to govern from an independent standpoint.
Thank you.
The only thing I'll add to that too is I did see some polling too showing that, the assumption was that perhaps the fact that she's declared herself as an independent, she would garner the majority of the independent vote, and that wasn't really playing out. So, sometimes, as I said, the small I versus independent candidates is that independents seem to be all over the place, and just because someone runs as independent doesn't necessarily mean they're going to garner the independent vote. And then, we're almost approaching February. My bet is just from a personal, from an ASU or Senate perspective, that she doesn't run. I think it's going to win.
Okay, thank you. Well, since we have such a variety of issues that are of interest to this audience, we're going to do a little sort of speed dating kind of thing. Christian, would you come up and we'll present? Do you have a guess of how many questions you have, a rough figure?
6.
6? Okay, so we'll do about 3 minutes on each, and we'll cover a lot of bases, and then we'll wrap up.
So we have a lot of the cards.
Move closer to the other Steve so that people can see.
So many of the cards were lovely essays, and I tried to boil them down into something that integrates them all together. So there were several about getting information. Given that an independent is not following cues from any party or news organization associated with that, it seems there's more burden of research for independents. Any suggestions on how independents could research issues and candidates?
I love that question. And I love the question, particularly when I referred to earlier that, we're now seeing 60% of young people are not party affiliated. And I always love this question, I always ask young people. One is that, where do you get your information? And sometimes I necessarily don't want to hear it. But it's not through the papers, it's not through mainstream. And I do ask them this question, particularly, if you want information about a candidate or a ballot initiative or a nonpartisan, where do you go to get that information? The first point I like to make is that I think this really is a call and a need for more civic education and more publications that give voters information in a non-partisan, non-biased way about the candidates. We do know from research where that exists in communities, there's more young people voting. And I think that's telling, right? That when there is that information, and a good example that I like to give is when we look at judicial races, right? So, we don't vote in Arizona on judges, but we do vote to retain them. But then we get a list of individuals that appear on the ballot, 30 of them. How do you, I struggled with this the last election, but how do you get information about, how well they performed? Because there isn't a lot of other information out there. So the other point I'd like to make is that I think with independents is that they have to do more due diligence, right? They have to spend more time researching the background of the individuals. I think the concern historically has been that if you take away party cues, then will individuals use other things like other demographics, education, business, male, female, as indicators and as cues for voting. But the bottom line is that there is a higher threshold for independence. But generally is that communities and states need to put more civic information out there so there's more informed voters and we're not just running to the political playbook. Last point I'd like to make on this, I know some states, Nevada was one that was considering it, is just allowing people party line vote. So you don't have to bother going through candidates or issues. You just push a button and it's all Democratic, which I just think is horrific in many ways. That go just the opposite instead of really giving people more information. With young people, we really have to go a lot deeper into where they're getting this information and maybe not be so taken back that they're looking at TikTok or they're looking at these other things and looking at what type of information is being put there, and then how do we get more information out on those platforms, because that is where young people are going to get their information. I didn't know that.
Okay, there was many that was talking about various issues, personal interests, personal issues, political issues, big things. Is there a chance that having more independent candidates will allow more issues to be discussed as opposed to the same candidates talking about the same thing and why they're better than the other person at the same thing?
Yes, I think so. In my experience, one thing that even though independents run the spectrum from an ideological or an issue point of view, one of the things that binds independents together is a kind of heightened awareness of and concern about the process itself. How do we produce solutions? How do we discuss policy? What's the process by which policy is adopted? All of those kinds of things come into play for independents because there's so many barriers right now. Yeah, and because the political dialogue and the policy discussion is so controlled. So I think the answer to that is yes, that as independents rise, as independents are more fully included in and integrated into the full body politic, you're going to see more of a demand for a broader range of policy initiatives to be considered and discussed, more opportunity to try to bring opposite sides together on a whole range of questions. I mean, look, let's face it, our country has very, very significant and serious challenges that we're facing right now. The international situation is, I'll just speak personally now, is terrifying. And we're just at the earliest stages. of that. And things that were thought to be solutions, compromises, etc., are not holding. And that's the era that we're living in. So we have to, just as human beings, we have to create a better environment for our country and for the world, in my opinion, to be able to engage the questions that are out there. But the system as it's currently constructed is so brittle and so controlled that you can't get there. And so in some ways, I think it would be fair to say that the thing that independents are saying, when someone decides to be an independent, they're making a statement of non-compliance with the existing state of affairs. They might have a full range of different opinions on a whole host of issues, but they do share that. And I think that is important. And I think if we can nurture that, frankly, nurture that non-compliance and use that to create a growthful and developmental environment where we can start to examine things in different ways and engage each other and policymakers, et cetera, in different ways. And I think that is the road to saving our country and creating a more humane world.
And I do think a factor in driving the exodus of two major parties is that people increasingly, given these hot button issues, don't fit one way or the other. I mean, when the parties are pretty intolerant. They're intolerant of their own party members that vote differently. If it's a Mitt Romney or Kristen Sinema, if you don't vote the party line, there's not much tolerance for both parties. And I think, as people and as citizens, they increasingly are conflicted about these very, very complex and tractable issues. And to sit there and say, this is how I vote because I'm a Democrat and Republican, when people are saying it's more complicated. These issues are more complicated on this. And we're not being allowed to have that discussion, right? Because right now it's either you support this or you don't support that. And I think that is why, research we mentioned earlier, I think it's intriguing because, if we're going to get out of our bubbles, maybe independence being part of this mix, there's more of an openness to consider different ideas, right? Than just live in these bubbles that don't allow us. And we have very few places where we have opportunities to share our social and political identity, right? Most concerned about young people is that, part of understanding who you are is being able to debate and deliberate and discuss and having access to accurate information. And we have limited places to do that. And the parties are being seen as not allowing that, right? This is how you vote as a Democrat, right? This is how you vote as a Republican. So.
Well, kind of on that, there's one about the fairness doctrine that you mentioned. What was that?
The fairness doctrine was a principle that governed media and media's relationship to policymaking, policymakers, and politicians, which is that if a media institution gave airtime to the expression of one point of view, that they were bound to give equal or roughly equal airtime to an opposing point of view. And that governed basically until the Reagan administration. And then it was one of the things that Reagan and others made go away. However they did it, they made it go away.
Okay. Vicky, would you read one or two more questions? One more question, and then we'll give the microphone to people in the audience if they feel anything is left out.
Okay, if I just get one, what's the process now independent voters can participate in primary voting?
Well, it differs by state. So in the state of Arizona, as Jackie has mentioned, is that independents are prohibited from participating in the presidential. But Arizona is kind of a semi-open state right now, is that if you want to vote in the primary and you're an independent, you can pull the ballot, right? So if you go vote in person, you can actually pull a Republican or Democrat ballot. If you vote by mail, you gotta do a little more thinking, a little more ahead, right? And actually request a ballot to be Republican, Democrat. So you don't have to change parties. You just have to request, and you can vote as a Republican or Democrat. In other states, it's much more challenging. And so the time period to switch over, in New York, how long is it?
It's now 6 months.
6 months. So in order to change a party in New York.
Let's leave it at Arizona, since we're these are Arizona people.
Right.
Let me ask you one more question. What if you want to go in the opposite direction? You are currently registered as a Democrat or Republican and you want to become an independent. What's the process for that?
So you could just simply change registration, right?
How do you do that? Contact the.
Yeah, you can contact the Secretary of State, you can contact civic organizations, they can give you the information to fill out.
Call your registrar. I've been doing it back and forth for years.
Yeah.
You call the
And-
registrar to say, I want to switch.
Right, and it's fairly easy, right?
By county.
Right, and
By county, the Yavapai
By
or Coconino County registrar. and
Registrar.
Make that
You do it by
request
mail,
over the
by
phone
phone.
and you can do it
Request
that
over
way.
the phone that you want to change for the purposes of voting in a presidential primary. That you
Yes.
want to change and declare a party so that you can vote in that.
and they'll send you
And-
verification.
And then after it's over with, you can call right back up and switch right back to independent.
Okay, good, thank you.
So the point I want to make also about that is that even though it's semi-open in Arizona, we still see low numbers of independents actually voting in primary, and part of that is an education issue. Most individuals do not understand that they have the ability to pull a ballot. Others out of principle say, I don't want to do that because I shouldn't have to join a party to vote. But we see low numbers of independents voting in primaries, even though they can pull ballots. Now they can't for president.
And that was a problem for me too, because I had no idea I could not vote till I heard it and read it somewhere. And then I had to call the registrar to find out. So we needed some way to inform people that.
Voter education on this issue needs to increase.
It's everything.
Okay, we have a question here.
Okay, we have some grassroots volunteers here, as you're talking about ballot initiatives, who are working to get Kennedy on the Arizona ballot. So we have petitions outside after the event, if you'd like to see us, if you'd like to help us get Kennedy on the ballot, who is independent, this sign our petition. So I want to let you know, we'll be out there.
Thank you very much.
I just had a quick follow-up question to what you were talking about.
Go ahead.
Okay, to clarify, you don't have to, I think I heard you say you don't have to change from independent to a party if you walk in to vote.
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't really clear on that. So right now, you actually have to change parties to vote in the presidential election. So you actually physically change to become a Republican or Democrat.
And you can do that by walking in and just changing it?
No, you'd have to go through the
Okay.
process and change parties. What I was saying that if you are voting down, other than the presidential, you can vote in the primary two ways. If you vote in person, you can request a Republican or Democrat ballot and they will give it to you. So as you go vote, you'll say, I want the Republican ballot, they'll give it to you. If you're an independent, you don't want to change parties, but you want to pull a ballot, Republican or Democrat, you can do that by mail, by notifying them in advance, and they will send you a Republican or Democratic ballot. Sorry if I wasn't clear on that.
Anyone else like to participate by asking a question? Yeah.
So I had a different experience. The last presidential election, the registrar sent me a letter as an independent voter asking me which ballot I wanted. And I know that she's changed, we don't have her anymore. So I don't know if that has an effect on what's happening now, but I got the same letter that you got. But the question is, as an independent voter, what can I do to equalize my voting rights with people who are in one of the other parties? You know, what is it that I can do to affect change?
I'll start. So one of the issues, if we're looking specifically at Arizona, and we're not endorsing ballot initiatives, but there is a ballot initiative, right? There'll be several round issue voting primaries, ranked choice voting, et cetera, that may appear on the 2024 election. But that really would allow anybody can appear on one ballot and you don't have to be part of a party to participate in that. So that would probably be a significant change as far as independents being able to participate equally with other Republicans and Democrats. It also equalizes how you appear on the ballot. So you do not have a higher threshold as an independent to become a candidate. The other area is when news sources are out there or newspapers are out there and they're addressing things with that two-party lens, is challenging them. You know, and particularly in the state of Arizona, where 36% of the vote is independents. And we know how Republicans are going to vote. We know how Democrats are going to vote. That is no big secret. To me, that's not news, right? The question is that start polling independents, because in Arizona, where we have these super, super close races, you know, look at the last election, every other state moved on, and we were still struggling with our attorney general and governor, right? Because they were so close. And that makes a difference, particularly when you look at the breakdown of Republican Democrats.
You know,
Okay, yeah.
Given the fact that the rise with the independent group, especially 49 and under, their ideas that they bring to the table versus the other two parties' ideas, how do you see AI coming into this? Is AI going to be a situation or issue down the road more and more with what we have to look forward to or look out for? If that makes sense?
Okay, we've got a comment from the phone. The last day to select the party for, what was it? Marianne? For the presidential, whatever, is February what? February 20th of this year.
yeah.
Good. Thank you. That's good.
Thank you.
Yeah. My first thought when you're at, well, besides my really first thought was, oy vey. My second thought was, if when Ross Perot ran in 1992, and again in 96, the refrain of the Perot movement was, we have to take our country back. I would say that the AI question raises the issue of who and how can we govern the rise of technology in a way which is beneficial to all people. And so I'm making a little bit of a leap here, because it's not as if the independent movement has a position on AI. But as human beings, I think many of us are concerned, not to be anti-technology, but concerned about the human and institutional capacity to govern the use of AI in ways that are positive for people. And so, to me, the link is that is a lot the question that independents are raising. Independents are raising the question of what's the proper form and culture of self-governance. And AI is an issue, to me at least, that raises the self-governance question, like, to the nth degree. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question about the issue of AI, because a lot of that is unknown, right? You know, maybe it's being part of ASU too, where, you know, we're the first university that's actually embracing AI platform and saying that, you know, it can be used for good and negative. And that's the same thing for elections. You know, there's some downsides, right? Because we're always trying to focus on how people can get access to accurate, factual information and to combat misinformation. AI can help us, right? It can add to the confusion, but it can also help us through different issues of technology. It also calls upon, you know, our election administration to constantly employ people with that technological background, but also to put out information that people have access to good, accurate information in a timely manner. So I think it's also, this is new for all of us, you know, teaching, talk to my colleagues, and the concern is, oh gosh, can I now do essay questions anymore because the students will just take it from, AI source? But there's other ways to work around that, right? Require them to use the readings you give them and to give personal examples. To combat that, or to look at perhaps how AI can increase people's ability to understand things. But this is the hot topic, is how AI and what impact it may have, given that there's so much misinformation out there. I did read, for example, is that, not all election administration has the .gov as part of their communication issue, and that is critical, right? Because it's less likely to be able to manipulate that if you don't have that website. So I think people are learning, but it's not always in the negative, right? Is that it also perhaps give us better tools to get that information out in a timely manner.
Okay, Vicky, do you have one more question on your list that you would like to see our panelists address?
Somebody referenced this in terms of youth, but I think it applies to anybody. How do you get reliable information on candidates and issues?
If you was starting from scratch and wanted to find out whether someone's qualifications and opinions, what would your first source be?
What's the first source? Well, first of all, let me take it, what we're thinking about the first source is, part of it is looking at how we do media literacy in general, right? Is that how do we look at sources? And we teach young people this, or attempt to teach young people this, about how you determine what is a factual source and how do you document that too, particularly through looking at social media, and to look at mainstream issues, right? And to fact check them with other data sources. Or other major news sources to see if that's an accurate story. So we go through these exercises right now just because there's so much misinformation out there, is taking a source, looking where it came from, and then start comparing it to other mainstream issues, or fact, there's sites that you can actually fact check on those. But I still go back to this issue. This doesn't substitute for a role of government and local governments to come out there, or nonprofit organizations to come out there and providing nonpartisan information about candidates, to give factual information. Clean Elections is one group that puts this information out there. When I was part of the Morrison Institute at ASU, we put out factual information on ballot initiatives that were scrutinized by the left and right and others, that were given this non-biased information and making them available to the public, so they can read that unfiltered from their party in politics. The sad thing is that we have very few of those sources, right? I mentioned the judicial races. I don't know about you, when I was in Nevada, we had a newspaper do polling from attorneys on judges' behavior. That's limiting, but it's something. I was looking here and really kind of struggled to look at how do I determine whether a judicial candidate is good or not. Right? There's no information out there to look at, even if you start Googling it and getting information.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yes, go right ahead.
I think, first of all, it's very, very hard to get that, because more and more candidates, particularly for higher office, are run with the input of consultants and the direction of consultants. And it's all very manufactured. So if you're a voter and you're trying to understand who a candidate is and what they stand for and all of that, you're basically being marketed to as a consumer, and it's very, very hard to break through that. The one thing I would say, though, perhaps, is this is something that independents are concerned with. Does a candidate in any way, shape, or form go up against the orthodoxy of the party that they are a part of, assuming that they are a partisan candidate, which most candidates are? Is there any evidence that they're actually a free-thinking individual who has the capacity to make a judgment and to not always vote party line? That, I'd love to see a way to be able to offer that kind of information to people.
Another one?
One more thing, the League of Women Voters is a source for nonpartisan information. They have candidate debates locally. They are both asked the same questions, or more than asked the same questions, and they answer those. And the debates are not partisan, they may be, but they're set up to be objective, and parties can participate. Is there anything else from League of Women Voter people? 411 vote 411.org is one source.
Okay.
We need more organizations like the League of Women Voters that provide this information.
Your thought, last thought or question?
I just wanted to do two things. First of all, we have a little survey, right?
Yeah.
Okay, did you all get the survey beforehand, or is it on
Would
the
you be
way?
ready, would you distribute those cards, please?
Okay, the reason for this, and everybody hates to be surveyed, I do too, but we have reserved this room for 4 weeks from today for the same time for a follow-up, and we're trying to decide what, if anything, we should do with that time. So this is your opportunity to tell us what things about this general topic you're most interested in, and Paul and I are going to look at those over the next few days and try and come up with another potential follow-up meeting to this, and get in more into the weeds with some of these topics. So please look that over, especially if you're interested in coming back for more. I can't believe how excited and involved everybody was. This is really terrific. So that's number one. And then number two is, I think this would be a great opportunity to thank our terrific guests for coming out here. So would you all please give them a nice round of applause? With that, I think
Give them a last comment, what they would
sure.
say to the audience or suggest.
Comment on the way out. Anything you'd like us to remember, or especially like to take away, or maybe we never asked.
I would just say that I'm really thrilled that we did this event together today and that we have this opportunity to talk about these issues in this kind of format, a very open-minded, exploratory format. I really appreciate all the questions, and I wish there were a million more of these gatherings going on around the country. So I just want to thank all of you, and a special thanks to the League for hosting, and to the two gentlemen to my left for organizing.
Same thing, I really appreciate the League of Women Voters, Paul, for organizing this, and the more opportunities we have to converse, and more spaces so people can deliberate and talk about issues is so important.
Well, we're honored that you came. Thank you, everybody.
And please vote for what we'll do next. Your vote counts.